The moment I walked into that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not grief. Something quieter than that, the particular calm that comes when you know exactly what's inside the folder you're carrying, and you know the other person in the room has no idea. I want to tell you how I got there. Because it didn't start in a courtroom. It started 34 years earlier, in a tiny apartment in Kitchener, Ontario, where a 26-year-old woman sat across a kitchen table from the man she loved and made a decision that would cost her everything and eventually give her something back she didn't know she'd lost. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 60 years old now, and I live in a house I chose myself, with a garden I planted myself, and a life that finally belongs to me. But for most of my adult years, I lived inside someone else's ambition. I watered it. I fed it. I gave it the best decades of my youth. And when it was finished growing, it turned around and told me I was no longer needed. I met my husband in the spring of 1987. I was working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company in Waterloo, and he was finishing his undergraduate degree at the University of Waterloo. He was charming in the way that some men are charming when they're young and hungry, always moving, always planning, always certain that the future was just one big break away. His name was Gerald Whitmore. And when he looked at you, he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in whatever room you were both standing in. We got married in August of 1990. I was 27, he was 28. The wedding was small, a reception at my parents' house in Cambridge, my sister as maid of honor, his 2 brothers standing up for him. We didn't have much money, but we were happy in the way that people are happy when they're too young to know what they don't yet have. 3 months after the wedding, Gerald told me he wanted to go back to school, not for a second undergraduate degree, not a diploma or a certificate. He wanted to apply to law school. He'd been thinking about it for years, he said. It was the only thing he'd ever really wanted to do. He pulled out pamphlets he'd already collected from Osgood and Western and Queen's. He'd already researched the application deadlines. He'd already written a draft of his personal statement. He hadn't mentioned any of this to me before we got married. I remember sitting at that kitchen table, the same table where we ate breakfast every morning, where I paid our bills, where I balanced our budget in a little green notebook, and looking at those pamphlets and feeling something complicated move through me. I loved him. I believed in him. And I was 27 years old, which means I also believed that love was enough to build a life on. What I didn't understand then, what took me 30 years to fully understand, is that believing in someone is not the same as having a plan, and a plan is not the same as a partnership. I told him yes. Law school in Ontario is 3 years. Gerald was accepted to Western's Faculty of Law in London, and so we moved. I found a job at an accounting firm in the city, a step down from what I'd been doing in Waterloo, but steady. We found a 2-bedroom apartment on Dundas Street, not far from the university, and we settled into the rhythm of a life organized entirely around his schedule, his exams, his articling applications, his career. I want to be fair here, because I've had a long time to think about all of this. Gerald was not, in those early years, a cruel man. He was grateful, in his way. He said thank you. He helped with dishes when he wasn't studying. He remembered my birthday. He told people, at parties, that he couldn't have done any of it without me. And I believed him, because it was true, and because when someone you love tells you that you matter, you want to hold on to that for as long as you can. What he never did, what I see clearly now, looking back, was ask me what I wanted. Not once, in 3 years of law school, did he sit down with me and say, "Dorothy, you gave up a good position in Waterloo to come here. You're carrying our finances on a bookkeeper's salary. What do you need? What are your plans? What do you want your life to look like when this is over?" He didn't ask because, I think, he assumed I had already answered that question by marrying him. My future was his future. My goals were his goals. My success would come through his success, like sunlight through a window, indirect, borrowed, not quite warm enough. I told myself this was normal. I told myself this was what love looked like. I told myself it was temporary. He graduated in 1993. He articled at a mid-size firm in Toronto, and we moved again, this time, to a 1-bedroom in North York while we saved enough for something better. I found work at a property management company doing accounts receivable. He was called to the bar in 1994. He joined the firm as an associate. And slowly, over the next several years, things improved. He made junior partner in 1999. We bought a house in Oakville in 2001. We had, by almost any external measure, a comfortable life. But somewhere in that decade, something shifted between us. I couldn't have named it at the time. It felt like he was always slightly ahead of me, moving through rooms a little faster, speaking a little louder, filling a little more space, and I was always a few steps behind, carrying things, arranging things, managing things, so that his life could run smoothly. I had become, without ever deciding to, the infrastructure of someone else's ambition. I never finished my accounting designation. There was always a reason, a move, his articling schedule, a particularly demanding period at the firm. I told myself I'd get back to it. I told myself there was time. There wasn't. The first sign of real trouble came in 2018. Gerald had by then become a senior partner specializing in corporate law. He worked long hours, which was normal, and traveled frequently for client meetings, which was also normal. But he had started to come home differently. There was a distance in him that I couldn't account for. He was on his phone more. He was less interested in conversations about anything other than his cases or the news. When I suggested we take a trip, something we used to do every February, usually somewhere in the Caribbean, he said he was too busy. When I suggested we see a marriage counselor, he looked at me as though I had suggested something faintly absurd. I started to pay closer attention. I had always managed our household accounts. Gerald handled the investments and the larger financial picture, a division of labor that had evolved naturally and that I had never questioned, which I now recognize as one of the more significant mistakes of my adult life. But I handled the day-to-day. I knew what came in and what went out. And in the fall of 2018, I noticed something that didn't add up. There was a transfer. $68,000 moved from our joint savings account into an account I didn't recognize. It had happened in 2 installments, $40,000 in September, $28,000 in October. The account number meant nothing to me. When I looked at the transfer records, the description simply said, investment reallocation. I am a bookkeeper. I have been a bookkeeper for 35 years. I know what investment reallocation looks like, and I know what it doesn't look like. And $68,000 moved quietly in 2 installments, described in the vaguest possible terms, does not look like investment reallocation. I didn't confront him. Not then. This is something people sometimes don't understand, why a woman who has just discovered something alarming would go quiet rather than explode. But I had been managing this man's life for nearly 3 decades. I knew how he argued. I knew how he deflected. I knew that if I came at him with accusations and no evidence, he would find a way to turn the conversation around until I was the one who felt foolish for asking. So I did what I'd always done. I paid attention. I kept records. And I waited. Over the next several months, I learned the shape of what was happening. He had been seeing someone, a colleague at his firm, a woman 12 years younger than me named Vanessa. I found this out not through confrontation but through the patient accumulation of small details. A charge at a restaurant we'd never been to together. A weekend he said he spent in Ottawa for a client that I later confirmed was never scheduled. A text message I wasn't meant to see. I didn't react. I simply filed it away. I also started making photocopies. Every financial document I could access, bank statements, investment records, mortgage documents, receipts, tax returns going back 20 years, I copied and organized. I kept them at my sister's house in Guelph in a lockbox she agreed to hold for me without asking too many questions. My sister, Paulette, is 6 years older than me, and she has a practical intelligence I've always envied. When I handed her that box, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You've known for a while, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. Gerald told me he wanted a divorce in February of 2020. He was, I'll give him that, relatively direct about it. He sat me down in the living room of our Oakville house, the house I had kept for 19 years. The house where the garden was mine and the kitchen was mine, and every corner had been arranged by my hands, and he said that he thought we had grown apart. that he wanted to pursue a different kind of life, and that he hoped we could handle the separation maturely. He did not mention Vanessa. I did not bring her up. What he did say, when we began to talk about the division of assets, was something that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "Dorothy, you have to be realistic about your contribution here. You've been a homemaker for the last several years. The assets we have are primarily a result of my career. I'm not saying you don't deserve something. I'm saying we need to be fair about what fair actually means." I had not been a homemaker for the last several years. I had worked until 2015 when I left my position at the property management company, partly because Gerald's income had made it financially unnecessary, and partly because he had spent 2 years making it clear, in the way that some men make things clear without ever quite saying them directly, that it would be easier for him if I were more available. I had then spent 5 years managing our household, our finances, our social calendar, our charitable commitments, and, for 3 of those years, the care of his mother, who had dementia and lived with us until she passed in 2018. I thought about his mother as he sat across from me telling me to be realistic about my contribution. I thought about the 3 years I had spent managing her medications, driving her to appointments, sitting with her on difficult nights when she didn't recognize where she was. I had done all of that without complaint, without compensation, and without recognition. And now the man I had done it for was asking me to be realistic. I looked at him very calmly and I said, "I think we should both get lawyers." My lawyer was a woman named Bernadette Osei Frempong, who had been recommended to me by Paulette's daughter, who was a paralegal in Hamilton. Bernadette was small and precise and had a way of listening that made you feel like nothing you said would surprise or upset her. When I laid out the full situation, the marriage, the financial history, the $68,000, the documents in the lockbox, his comments about my contribution, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mrs. Callahan, I think you've done a lot of my work for me." What followed was 14 months of legal proceedings, which I will not describe in detail because, frankly, the process of family law litigation is one of the least interesting things I have ever been through, even when the outcome matters enormously. What I will tell you is this. Gerald's legal team presented a version of our marriage in which I was a dependent spouse of limited financial contribution, whose standard of living had been entirely the product of his professional success, and who was entitled to a modest settlement and spousal support for a defined period. This version of events omitted, among other things, the 3 years I had worked in London to support us while he completed law school, the subsequent moves I had made to accommodate his career, the years I had worked in Toronto and then Oakville at positions below my skill level because his schedule left no room for me to pursue advancement, the 5 years of household management and elder care that had allowed him to work without interruption or domestic concern, and the $68,000 that had been moved from our joint account without my knowledge or consent. Gerald's lawyer was good. He was a tall man from a Bay Street firm who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room. At one point during the proceedings, he submitted a document suggesting that my contributions to the household had been ordinary domestic services that could be reasonably valued at a figure substantially lower than what my lawyer was arguing. Ordinary domestic services. I wrote those words in the margin of my notepad and circled them twice. Here is what I want to tell you about the courtroom, because this is the part that matters. There was a moment, it came during a session in late spring of 2021, in a courtroom in Brampton when Gerald's lawyer finished presenting their financial summary and turned to the judge with the satisfied air of a man who believes he has just settled the matter. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Justice Anand, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, looked at the documents in front of her and then looked at Bernadette. Bernadette stood up and said, "Your Honor, my client has prepared a summary of her financial contributions to this marriage, beginning in 1990. With your permission, I'd like to submit it." She handed Justice Anand a bound document, 43 pages, organized by year, cross-referenced with bank statements, tax returns, pay stubs, expense records, and, at the end, A detailed accounting of the approximate market value of the caregiving services I had provided to Gerald's mother between 2015 and 2018, calculated according to the Ontario government standard rates for professional home care. It also included a full accounting of the $68,000, where it had gone, which I had determined through careful research, and what it had been used for. The room was quiet while Justice Anand read. Gerald's lawyer leaned over to say something to Gerald in a low voice. Gerald was looking at the document in the judge's hands with an expression I recognized the look of a man who has just realized that the story he'd been telling himself is not the only story in the room. I had spent months preparing that document. Not in anger, or not only in anger, but with the particular focus that comes when you realize that the only language certain people understand is evidence. I had learned that language from 35 years of bookkeeping. I had applied it to the most important account of my life. Justice Anand looked up from the document. She looked at Gerald's lawyer. Then she looked at Gerald, and she said, in a voice that was entirely level and almost pleasant, "Counsel, I think we're going to need to revisit your client's characterization of the marital contributions here." I did not cry. I had promised myself I wouldn't, but I pressed my hand flat against the table and I breathed very slowly, and I let the feeling move through me, the feeling of 30 years of work being seen, finally, by someone with the authority to do something about it. The settlement took another 4 months to finalize. I won't give you every detail because some of it is still private, and also because the numbers are less important than what they represented. What I will tell you is that I received a share of the matrimonial home, a portion of Gerald's pension, a lump sum that accounted for the $68,000 and then some, and spousal support for a period that my lawyer considered fair, given the length of the marriage and the nature of my career interruptions. It was not everything. It was never going to be everything. But it was recognition, legal, formal, documented recognition that what I had done had value and that someone in a position of authority had looked at the evidence and agreed. Gerald's relationship with Vanessa lasted, I'm told, about 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I don't say this with satisfaction. I say it simply because it is what happened. I moved to Guelph in the fall of 2021, close to Paulette, close to her grandchildren, close to the kind of quiet I hadn't known I was missing until I had it. I took a course at the University of Guelph, not accounting, not anything practical, just a course in Canadian literature that I had always wanted to take and never had. I joined a book club. I started walking in the mornings along the Speed River, in any weather, because I had learned that I like being outside more than I ever knew when I was spending my days inside someone else's schedule. And I want to say something now to whoever is listening to this, because I know that some of you have lived a version of this story, and some of you are living it right now, and I want to say it as plainly as I can. Keep records. I don't mean this cynically. I don't mean it as advice to go into a marriage expecting it to fail. I mean it as the same advice I would give anyone managing anything of value. Document what you contribute. Keep copies of financial records that affect your life. Understand the accounts that carry your name. Do not assume that love and fairness are the same thing, because they are not. And the gap between them is where a lot of women I know have lost things they can never get back. If you have paused your career or your education for a partner, that sacrifice has value, legal, financial, and human value. Don't let anyone, in a courtroom or anywhere else, describe it as ordinary. There is nothing ordinary about giving someone the years of your life. Those years are the most extraordinary thing you have to give. If you are in a marriage where you feel the financial picture is unclear to you, start asking questions now, gently, and if the answers don't satisfy you, ask them again. A marriage where one partner is excluded from financial decisions is not a partnership. It is an arrangement that serves only one of the people in it. If you are being told that your contribution to a home, a family, a life together is worth less than a professional salary, know that the law, at least in this country, does not agree. The law recognizes unpaid domestic work. The law recognizes career sacrifice. The law recognizes the value of care. But the law can only work with what you give it, and what you give it is evidence. I was 60 years old when that settlement was finalized. I am not going to pretend that there was no grief in that grief for the years, grief for the marriage I thought I had, grief for the version of myself who sat at a kitchen table in Kitchener in 1990 and said yes without asking nearly enough questions. That woman deserved better, not because she was foolish, but because she was trusting, and trust, when it is not matched, is one of the loneliest things in the world. But I am also 60 years old, and I am walking along the Speed River every morning and reading novels I never had time for, and sitting with my sister on her porch in the evenings and watching the light change over her garden. And something that I thought was gone, something I had not quite been able to name for 30 years, has come back to me. It feels like the particular confidence of a woman who has accounted for every dollar and found that the numbers, in the end, told the truth. I am not angry. Or I am, sometimes, in the way that is appropriate and human and honest. But underneath the anger, there is something steadier. There is the knowledge that I did what needed to be done, carefully and patiently and well. There is the knowledge that the documentation I kept in a lockbox at my sister's house in Guelph became the evidence that changed the outcome of my own life. There is the knowledge that you do not have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be prepared. And you have to know, you have to truly believe that your years, your work, your sacrifice, your care, none of it was ordinary. Every hour of it was extraordinary, and every hour of it counted.